Thank you guys very much for being here. If he had told me that this many people were going to come, I probably would have chickened out. Too late now. Yes, thank you for being here. I've been lucky enough to give talks in a lot of cool places, but seriously, none of them cooler than the Draper Museum, much less the Center of the West. So this is pretty awesome. So thank you for being here. I'm really bad with the microphone, so if I forget to hold this up close enough, please just tell me. So as Corey kind of alluded to, I've been coming out to the basin since 2010 to lead paleontological expeditions. And a few things have evolved over that time, but I'm going to go back to the more distant past for now. I like to point out that it was only in 1842 that we first started thinking about the concept of a dinosaur. And that seems so recent. You know, like chemistry has its origins in the Middle Ages or the ancient times. Physics, the Middle Ages. We didn't have any clue about geology until maybe the 1600s and 1700s when we started digging canals all over England and the northeastern United States. 1842, that's really recent for something that's, for a science, for any science, much less one that's so popular. And the term was coined by Sir Richard Owen in 1842, who's standing there with some fossils, and this is him as an old man. Little known fact, Sir Richard Owen still holds the title for the creepiest paleontologist that ever lived. That man did not age well. And then so much of the history of paleontology is in the West. The first dinosaur remains ever found in North America were found just a little bit north of here at the confluence of the Judith River and the Yellowstone, if I remember correctly, in 1854. By this fascinating man. He was a Civil War veteran. He became a renowned geologist for the country. But at the time, 1854, the middle of Montana, this was still a little bit wild and dangerous territory. He actually kept himself safe, unwittingly or unknowingly, because he earned the nickname among the Native Americans as he who runs quickly and picks up stones. They thought he was crazy. They literally thought he was crazy, which, in their culture, esteemed him to be something like a medicine man. So they left him alone. I love that story. Oh, and I'm sorry. Those are the first dinosaur fossils ever found in North America, and those are the ones from central Montana, a little bit north of the basin, but not too far away. And then we bring it back east. The very first dinosaur, the very first nearly complete dinosaur skeleton anyone ever found anywhere was found in New Jersey. I know, no one would have guessed that. I wouldn't have either. And it wasn't until 1858, and it was described by this man, Joseph Leidy. He was a scientist in Philadelphia, but his nickname was the last man to know everything, and he actually earned that nickname as well. He was a renowned expert in lots of different fields, wildly different fields. He was the first person to use forensic evidence to solve a murder back east. He was just an astounding man, and he really loved this job of describing this dinosaur, Hadrosaurus folci, again, the first nearly complete skeleton found anywhere in the world. But he quickly discovered, as we'll talk about in a minute, that dinosaur paleontology wasn't for him. It turns out there's a lot of egos in paleontology, and he could stick to those other sciences and still make a great contribution. It was only about 8 years later that the world's second nearly complete dinosaur skeleton was found. This one also in New Jersey, and this one was found, described by Edward Drinker Cope, and he named it Laelaps. It was later changed by another man, O.C. Marsh, to the name Driptasaurus. And this is a big meat-eating dinosaur, kind of related to TRex, but not too closely, but a big meat eater. But you can see these dates are really, really recent. This is just the beginning of paleontology, and we still, even though we're naming them and kind of figuring out that okay, they're lizards, but we don't really know what they are or why they're here, we just didn't really have a clue. So this is O.C. Marsh. So Edward Drinker Cope was the famous paleontologist in Philadelphia. He started off as friends with O.C. Marsh, and I'd love to come back sometime and just talk about the feud between these guys. They started off as friends through a number of silly things that happened that they did to each other. They ended up as bitter enemies, literally going to their deathbeds trying to outdo each other, literally. They would even go so far as these guys were dandies. They never went out west. They would send young guys out west to dig up dinosaurs, and they would tell them at the end of the season, if you haven't gotten the whole skeleton, blow it up with dynamite because I don't want the other guy to get it. It was crazy. They sent their guys out there armed, thinking that they were going to get in a gunfight. I don't think that they ever did, but they were looking for it. They also did what every other Easterner does when they come out here. They go to a local place to get their pictures taken after dressing up with guns and other gear. So the connection to all this is Philadelphia, my hometown. Oh, not hometown, sorry, I just moved there a few years ago. But where I've been working and living for the last several years, and mostly at this museum. This unassuming building is the Academy of Natural Sciences. This is the oldest museum in the New World and holds over 19 million objects. Some really, really special and amazing things from our history. That's not its original building. The original building is there. That's Charles Willson Peale. He is famous for painting all of the original founding fathers. If you've ever seen paintings of the founding fathers, they were probably done by him. And that's a self-portrait of himself in the original Academy of Natural Sciences, what became the Academy, and it was actually in one wing of Independence Hall, where they signed the Declaration of Independence. That is where the first museum in the New World ever got started. And a lot of these fossils that I've been talking about are there, which is really cool for me to see some of my specimens get put in drawers right next to specimens holding Lewis and Clark's specimens. The Lewis and Clark herbarium is there. A number of fossils that William Clark collected from this place called Big Bone Lick in Kentucky. He collected them there, brought them to Jefferson at Monticello, and they laid them out on the floor, and Jefferson dropped everything just to study those bones. And those are some of those bones right there. And there's me apparently sleepwalking. I don't know why I couldn't have found a better picture, but those are some of Thomas Jefferson's specimens right next to some of our specimens we've been collecting lately. Okay, just a little bit more history and we'll get into it. It wasn't until much later, 1884, that the first paleontological expedition came to the Bighorn Basin. And it was led by Walter Berryman Scott, Henry Fairfield Osborn. These are big names in the history of paleontology. And these guys became friends. Again, they went out west, got all dressed up, and looked for fossils. They became friends, and as undergraduates in paleontology, they got really interested in finding new areas in the West. So, of course, it was their strong conviction that they founded academic paleontology in the United States. As I said, ego in paleontology is a problem, and it continues to be so today. Nothing's changed in that regard. They first came out in 1884. Unfortunately, they found next to nothing. It was pretty unsuccessful. But they recognized the geology, they recognized the area, and they knew that there had to be something here. So Walter Berryman Scott kept coming back out and brought his students, William J. Sinclair and Walter Granger, and they eventually established the Bighorn Basin to be a very prolific area for fossils, and of fossils of all ages. Again, these are pretty famous names in the history of paleontology and science in this country. Those guys established the Bighorn Basin not just to be pretty prolific, but especially for Cenozoic mammals. So the Cenozoic is a time period that started right when the dinosaurs went extinct, so about 65 million years and younger. And it is still that way. This is one of Sinclair's students, Glenn Jepson. He spent his entire career coming out here and studying those mammals again, the pretty old mammals. There's some pretty amazing mammal fossils in the Bighorn Basin. Some of those old coal mines outside of Red Lodge and near Bear Creek, those hold, collected from there, we have found primate teeth, some of the oldest primates anywhere in the world. You know, you think primates, you think, okay, Africa, maybe South America. No, primates may have gotten started in Western North America, including in the Bighorn Basin. And this is Dr. Jepson's student, David Paris, and Dave worked at the New Jersey State Museum for nearly 50 years, and he was my mentor. That's me out with him in 2010. He had been coming out here since the 60s to do his field work. So obviously he was getting on in age. When I first came out with him in 2010, he told me he was turning that program over to me. Now, Dave is textbook Quaker. He did not do or like anything that would bring him attention, including and especially dinosaurs. I would joke, but I'm not sure it's so much of a joke, that he would kick a dinosaur bone down the hill to look for a mammal tooth. And mammal teeth are tiny, and they're pretty rare. To him, a successful 2-month-long field season would be to find 2 teeth like this. And I immediately came out here and saw this gorgeous landscape and knew that people would love to do this, and people would love to sign up and to help us do this. But people would not love to sign up and spend all that money to come out here and maybe find 1 mammal tooth. So we shifted our focus to dinosaurs pretty quickly. So I always hesitate to show this slide because I would like to make something very, very clear. I am not insinuating in any way that I am some kind of Princeton man or anything like that. I got my degrees in geology from Auburn University in Alabama, about as far as you can get from Princeton in every way. But I just like to show that there's been a long tradition of paleontology in this area, and I've just got lucky to be in the right place at the right time, and Dave was a wonderful, wonderful mentor. So I left the State Museum in 2017 and started our organization. But the other thing I wanted to point out with that last slide, and this one too, is that we are not the only ones doing vertebrate paleontology in the Bighorn Basin, not even close. There are at least a dozen, perhaps dozens of different groups from universities all over the country and museums all over the world who come to the Bighorn Basin to study different layers of rock, different ages, different fossils, all kinds of things. Just down the road from one of our sites is the Naturalis Museum from the Netherlands. Dr. Kirk Johnson is the director of the Smithsonian Institute, the Natural History Museum, and he comes out here to study climate change preserved in the rocks. So this has long been a very, very prolific area for paleontology and is hugely important to the study of everything that we do. Okay, a little bit more into the science now. So how do we get fossils? Fossils have to be, or animals have to get preserved in a sedimentary environment. And all that means is an area where sediments or tiny little particles settle out of suspension, usually water, and go down to the bottom of that water and over time collect into big, thick layers. So we are talking about, usually we're talking about rivers, deltas, shallow oceans, lakes, but usually rivers. And what makes the Bighorn Basin so great is that for almost the last 500 million years, almost without interruption, we have had rivers or oceans covering this area. So we have almost a nearly constant record of sedimentation for the entire last half billion years. So these are all names of geologic periods in which macroscopic life has lived. Before that, there was life down here, but it was just single-celled organisms floating around in the ocean. The Bighorn Basin has in it every single one of these except for one, and that's pretty amazing. But that's not exactly what sets the Bighorn Basin apart and makes it so special, makes it a natural laboratory. Now, I have done my best here to make some animation to try to illustrate an important point. I don't know how good this is going to be, but imagine that these are different layers of sediment that built up and turned into rock over those last 500 million years, okay? They just build up, build up, and build up. And what's great about this is that, well, let me back up. There are plenty of places on Earth where you get all those layers stacked on top of each other. But to reach them, you have to drill down, right? And I realize this is not a drill rig, that's an oil pump, but it looks cool, so I used it. To reach those rocks underneath, you have to drill down. And that's great, but all you're going to come up with is a core of rock about this big. And that's fantastic. It's perfectly fine if you're studying microfossils and things like that, or ancient pollen grains, but you're not going to hit a dinosaur, and even if you do, you're not going to figure out what that is from that little piece. So what separates this area from all those other areas that have those flat layers is that we have these mountains around them. About 70 million years ago, the Pacific plate was crashing into North America and forced up all the mountains that are around the Bighorn Basin now. In doing so, they didn't just push up through those flat layers. Let's see if this works right. They didn't just push up through those flat layers and leave them flat. They bent them all. They created this huge bowl. So I'm going to try to do this with my fingers without dropping this. Hopefully this is, nope, that's not on. Okay, so I'm going to yell. So all those layers are flat. Forgive me if you're online. I will try to speak very loudly. All those layers are basically flat. The mountains push up on the outside and push them up like this. In doing so, they also drop down the middle. And that dropping down the middle is, low spots collect water, right? You get a lot of plants, you get a lot of water, that's a swamp. You get a swamp long enough, you create coal. And that's why there's so much coal near the middle of the basin, like in Bear Creek and Belfry and Red Lodge. But the important thing is that these layers are bent up into one giant bowl, and then the edges are eroded off, and that is where my animation fails me. All these layers come up to the surface, and the erosion cuts off the tops. So literally, here's the basin. So literally, you're looking at a giant bowl, and you can stand in the middle and walk in any direction and walk over the tops of those older layers that used to be thousands of feet down in the ground. So this is what makes the Bighorn Basin so special. There's only a couple of places in the world where you can do this. And so previously, if I wanted to study things like long-term evolution or climate change, I would have to pick some rocks in Pennsylvania, maybe go some different rocks in Antarctica, different rocks in Europe, and start cobbling together that timeline, okay? That's okay, but obviously you're sampling different regions. Here we can sample one region and the change that happened in this one region over the last 500 million years. So this is what makes the Bighorn Basin so special, makes it a natural laboratory, and makes it a place for scientists from around the world to flock to and have for 100 years. It's also an asymmetrical basin. My figures and my fingers, obviously, that's a very simplified version. There's a lot more going on in there, but it's an asymmetrical basin. And the west side of the basin is more than 4 miles deep. It's an incredible place. There's a simplified geologic map. Again, that's kind of got that bullseye situation going on there. That's obviously simplified for somebody's textbook. This is the real thing. And it's just an amazing, amazing place. Okay, so now on to our real paleontology. When I first started working out here in 2010, for the first 5 or 6 years, we were working in Cretaceous rocks, really just outside of Powell. And this is what the world looked like at the time. It was a time of extreme heat. It was so hot, there was no ice at the North Pole or the South Pole or pretty much anywhere else. For that reason, sea levels were hundreds of feet higher. So much of what we know today, I mean, this is starting to take shape. It's pretty recognizable, right? Except a lot of it's underwater. And where we are is right about there, right there, right at the edge of a seaway and mountains being pushed up and all the rivers dumping sediment off those mountains towards the ocean. So again, we've got that great sedimentary environment to house and that is very livable for a lot of dinosaurs, but also a great place to preserve those dinosaurs. And the late Cretaceous is a time that had a lot of dinosaurs that just about anybody would recognize. You've got TRex, Triceratops, Pachycephalosaurs, duck-billed dinosaurs back there, the ankylosaurs, the armored tanks of the dinosaur world. This is a pretty prolific time and one that just about every kid knows. And these are all some of the dinosaurs that we found fairly regularly. Not, when I say found, we didn't find the whole thing. We found parts of them, a lot of teeth, Triceratops horns. The Triceratops horns and frills, those things are just everywhere. Seriously, Triceratops is a dime a dozen at this point. It's almost a little frustrating. And so occasionally we would find some good bones like that one. Again, there's a young Triceratops horn sticking out of the side of the hill, out of some incredibly hard rock. Again, this is right off of Polecat Bench from Powell. There's the cross-section of a T-Rex femur in there with my buddy Jason. So we would find a lot of fossils here. The problem is the rocks we were working in are an environment that was relatively high energy, meaning that the water was moving fast, and when water is moving fast, it rolls those bones around, scatters them, breaks them down, and so it's just not a great place for finding those kinds of fossils. We ended up spending most of our time on the ground like this because usually what we're finding are the other smaller critters that lived at this time. Remember, big river system, a lot of swamps, it's very hot and humid, so I tell people all the time, it was a lot like the Louisiana Delta is today, and with a lot of the same critters. We find the fossilized scales of alligator gar, which are fish that still live today down there. We find lots and lots of the armored plates from crocodiles that lived at the time. Again, Louisiana, we had snakes, birds, everything Louisiana has today, except we also had dinosaurs. Turtles. Turtles are another problem. They are, if any animal is meant to be preserved as a fossil, it's a turtle with that big hard shell on its stomach and back. We would find these shells everywhere, usually exploded, and seriously, it got to the point where if I didn't find a complete shell that was undisturbed and unbroken, I'd just keep walking. They're just everywhere. So that was the Cretaceous. Again, it was good, but not fantastic. Those scales are everywhere. The crocodile scutes are everywhere. No one's making any new great scientific discoveries in these places, unfortunately. And then, so all the land we work on is Bureau of Land Management land, and they have been so kind to us and so generous and help us accomplish our mission, which is to find fossils and learn about our planet's history. And so about 2015, I believe, they alerted us to a site of a dinosaur that had been dug up in 1999 and said that the tarp that the scientists used to cover it up was starting to show. Bright blue tarp out there in the middle of the desert. Obviously, that can be seen for a long time. They don't want that. So our job was just to go out there and cover that back up and be back on our way. And we've never left since because that area just keeps giving us dinosaurs. Just this season, we have 2 new quarries with hundreds of bones in each. These Jurassic sediments in this area are so prolific, it's amazing. So again, this is North America, going back a little bit farther, about 90 million more years farther back to about 150 million years ago. Pangea, or the great supercontinent, had just started to break up not too long before. You can see the Atlantic Ocean is pretty narrow. We're within spitting distance of Africa. But again, another ocean over here near the Bighorn Basin, mountains building over here, and rivers dumping all the sediment from those mountains into that ocean. So another great place for dinosaurs to live and to be preserved. So again, a lot of dinosaurs you probably recognize from your kids' books or your grandkids' books. We don't have TRex, but we have Allosaurus, another big meat eater. Not quite as big, but still pretty big. All of the long-necked, long-tailed dinosaurs like Brontosaurus, Apatosaurus, Diplodocus, they all lived during this time. And my favorite, the Stegosaurs, all lived during the Jurassic as well, and all in this area. So we study, the Jurassic rocks around here are all from what's called the Morrison ecosystem, or the Morrison Formation. And the Morrison ecosystem was enormous. And you can't find it at the surface of all these locations right now, but this is how big it was. It was huge. And again, a big river system dumping sediments off those mountains. And it's about 150, 145 million years old, and it's very, very famous for being absolutely full of these dinosaurs. It's probably the most heavily studied geological formation in the world when it comes to paleontology. This is a stegosaur that we got a few years ago. You can kind of see the bones, the limb bones are just stacked on top of each other, 3 and 4 deep. We have a string of vertebrae going like this. So right away, we saw that the Jurassic rocks in our area are just going to be a whole lot better for us. They just preserve a lot more dinosaurs, a lot more of each dinosaur, than those Cretaceous sediments ever did. We've got a lot of allosaur bits. This is a big hip bone. And then this is a relatively complete juvenile Allosaurus we found a few years ago. I know it's a little bit hard to tell, but we've got a femur there. The lower limb bones are here. You think about a bird with long legs, like a flamingo, and when they sit down, all their limbs just kind of fold under themselves. That's what this guy did. He just sat down, limbs folded under himself, and he just sat and waited for us to find him 150 million years later. We found bits of the jaw, perfect little claws, parts of the skull, and skulls are very, very rare. So this was a really exciting specimen. This is a dinosaur that is 100% unique only to the Bighorn Basin. This was the dinosaur that was found in 1999 that I mentioned a few minutes ago. And so far, there's only one known skeleton known to science of this dinosaur. It's called Stuwasia, which is from the Crow language, and it means first thunder. I am not pronouncing that correctly. I met a native Crow man this summer who pronounced it. I can't do it justice. And so we found a good bit of the skeleton, or they did, in 1999. The white bones are all the ones that they found, including parts of the skull, which is pretty great. But that's what they found in 1999, and nothing else from it has ever been found until this one, we hope. We're not 100% sure, but we are hoping that this is the second known specimen of Stuwasia. We've got the hips behind my, well, we had some neck vertebrae up here and a couple from the middle back, but they were all kind of randomly scattered. And then we've got the hips behind my hand, and the tail goes out. Again, the hips, tail goes out, and it continues, and it even curls over itself like a little pig's tail and ends right there with the last bone in his tail that's no bigger than my pinky. That is one of the best specimens I have ever worked on. It is very rare to find anything articulated, meaning the bones are still put together like they are in life, much less complete. There's just too many things that can happen to a skeleton to make it be not complete. It can be scavenged, it can be washed away in a flood. There's just dozens of things. And to some of us, it drives us crazy, like, okay, the hips are there, the tail's there, the tail's perfect. Why are the legs not there? One of my colleagues in my team, it drives him insane that the legs are not there. You just can't worry about these things. There's no way to know what happened, but there's a million things that could have happened to them. Okay, so that area I just described was what we call the Anderson area. We have 4 or 5 active quarries at the Anderson site right now, but this is the Mother's Day site, and this is still in the basin, closer to Bridger. And this is a famous site because it was founded on Mother's Day in 1994. The Museum of the Rockies worked it for 2 years. Then Cincinnati inherited it, and they worked it for 13 years. And in those combined 15 years, more than 2,500 bones came out of a hole that is not much bigger than this room. And in the 5 or 6 years we've worked there, we've had at least 500 more bones. So we're talking 3,000 bones. But that's not what, I mean, a bone bed is cool, but that's not what makes this site special. Every single one of those bones is from one species. And what makes it even cooler is that every single one of those bones comes from a young Diplodocus. It's not just a monospecific bone bed, it's a monospecific bone bed of just young ones. Not necessarily babies, but definitely not adults, somewhere in between, probably like teenagers. And that is really cool because I'll be the first one to admit there's a lot of arm waving in paleontology. There's only so much we can learn from the skeletons and partial skeletons. But when you have a situation like this, now we're still arm waving, but we can at least make educated arm waves about behavior. Why in the world was there a band of teenagers roaming around without adults? And that's some of the questions we're trying to answer. And one of the great things about a site like this that's been studied so well and has so many bones is you can attack it from a lot of different scientific angles. And they have put together one of the most thorough and robust hypotheses for this site that I've ever seen for any paleontological site. So it's really exciting to be working there. Out of all those 3,000 bones, really only one skull has been found. That's Harper. I'll come back to her in a moment. She helped us pull out that toe of a Diplodocus. Out of all those 3,000 bones, really only one skull has been found. And this is really exciting. That's how big it is, pretty small. And it's cool because it shows us that the young ones had a different number of teeth than the adults and had different shaped teeth from the adults, which tells us that they were eating different plants, which is really, really cool. We do not get windows into the lives of things that lived 150 million years ago this clear very often at all. So it's pretty cool. So again, Morrison Formation is the most heavily studied unit on the planet when it comes to paleontology. But when I say that, what I really mean is south of that line, it is the most heavily studied unit. North of that line, we don't know much about it. There's not as much outcrop, but there's plenty to be working on. It's just that Dinosaur National Monument is here, so that gets a lot of headlines. There's more outcrop down here. People just haven't spent time up here, but I think they also just took it for granted that, yeah, it's just more Morrison. We'll just find more of the same thing. But we're not. We're finding different things. Stuwasia, for example. Stuwasia has not been found anywhere else. We don't find a lot of the species up here that are very, very common down here. A lot of the things, just about everything that we're finding up here is also pretty small. And we haven't determined that they're all young yet or if they're small adults. Either way, it's an interesting story that we need to figure out the whys. But that's part of our job, is to work farther north in the Morrison and figure out some of these answers. It's not just the same thing. It's not just more of the southern Morrison. So yeah, that's what we're doing. And I don't want to give anybody the impression that we are trophy hunters. We're not just out here for dinosaurs. We are here for those fish. We collect rock specimens, plant specimens, anything we can to figure out what the ecosystem was like 150 million years ago. I tell kids all the time, you know, if aliens came down to Earth and they want to learn everything they can about Africa, but all they do is take a lion back up to the spaceship with them, that's great. They're going to learn a little bit about a lion, but they're not going to learn that much about Africa and the ecosystem. And that's what it would be like if we only took the dinosaurs. So we're out there trying to get everything we can. So our specimens, we will load them up on a giant trailer at the end of the season. I'll drive them back to Philadelphia into our lab. Our lab is in the Academy of Natural Sciences in the back of Dinosaur Hall. I'm really proud of that, although the space is really, really tiny. It's not big enough. We need bigger space to accommodate more volunteers and these bigger bones. But we're doing what we can. There's our giant trailer. I bought that last summer thinking, this thing's going to last us forever. It's enormous, right? We filled it up the first year with 3¼ tons of bones. And we are being selective in what we take back. We cannot possibly take everything back. The vast majority of the stuff that we find stays in the ground. So as Corey mentioned, our original name was the Bighorn Basin Paleontological Institute. We changed that name for a number of reasons, including the fact that no one can say paleontological, much less spell it. But also because I want to bring our brand of science, which is citizen science, to all the other natural history sciences as well. And most of the folks that come out with us are from back east, have never seen mountains like this, have never seen deserts like this. I've literally had some college-age people in tears when they go up on the pass. They just can't get over how beautiful it is. So we bring people out here and introduce them to all the sciences and the landscape and everything. We do a lot of education. This little girl who's adorable is in the Boys and Girls Club in Red Lodge, and we do programs with them and any other group we can. And then this is Tucker. This is the most meaningful thing that we do. We have had 3 Make-A-Wish kids come out with us in the past. Tucker's the first one that didn't make it. And he passed away about 13 months ago, and that was his sister, Harper. And before dying, he made his parents promise to come back out with us this year and bring his youngest brother, who couldn't come a couple years ago. And so they were out with us last week. And so that was really special for us. So we do a lot of cool things. I'm really proud of the science we do, but the Make-A-Wish stuff is the best. So with that, I feel like I blew through that. I'm really sorry if that was really short, but I'm happy to answer all the questions you might have.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
When you see an outcropping, how do you decide where to start exploring?
We don't. We just start walking. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. He asked, if we go to a new outcrop, how do we know where to start looking? We don't. We just start walking. And that's one of the first things we teach the new people that come out with us each week. They want to know, they're terrified. They think everything looks like a rock. They're never going to see a dinosaur bone. Within 5 minutes, I can show you what the dinosaur bones look like, and then within 10 minutes out in the field, I can show you what they look like in the ground, and you just start seeing it everywhere. There are places out there where you literally cannot walk without stepping on dinosaur bones. You just have to have the mental image, and it's pretty simple. But when we go up to a new outcrop, we won't just go to any random outcrop. We'll think about the geology. For example, if you drive around it here, you might see like a blood red layer of rock. It's just gorgeous. That's Triassic in age, so it's not the age we want to look for, so we would avoid it for that reason. And just having a general geology background, we know that it just doesn't have many fossils in it. So we just avoid it in that way just by knowing a little bit about the geology. But otherwise, we literally just walk around slowly looking at the ground. That's how you find them. Everybody wants to know, too, how do you know where to dig, and how deep do you dig until you find a dinosaur? You don't. We would never find dinosaurs that way. You literally walk around, you look for broken bits out on the surface, and if you're lucky, you'll find more. Once you find some broken bits, you start following them uphill, because erosion will push them down. And if you're lucky, you'll find where they're eroding out of the ground, and then you might start digging or brushing. But until then, you're just walking around. That's about it. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry, I'm jumping the gun. Sorry, Corey.
Oh, okay.
For our online audience.
What is the hypothesis about the Mother's Day site? And two, if the juveniles have different teeth, does that mean that they lose their teeth?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. They are reptiles, and reptiles constantly lose their teeth. So yes, they would have lost their teeth. I'm pretty sure about that. So the Mother's Day hypothesis is really amazing. What I usually do for my people is I'll just say the whole hypothesis and then I'll break it down. So the hypothesis is that you had an age-segregated herd of Diplodocus roaming around at the end of a dry season. And the environment at this time was pretty dry for most of the year, wet along the rivers that stayed wet, and then pronounced wet seasons for maybe 2 months, basically monsoons. So you had this gang of teenagers roaming around. They were waiting out the dry season, probably were visiting a usually reliable watering hole, but the rains didn't return on time, and they died. And we even know that they probably laid out desiccating for just 1 to 2 months before the rains came back. And then the rains came back catastrophically. And anybody out west knows that when the rains come, they come hard. And it's not just a flash flood of white water. A lot of times that flash flood is like a slurry of debris, trees, mud. A lot of times that slurry can be the consistency of wet cement, but traveling at 30 or 40 miles an hour. So that's called a debris flow. And that debris flow came, picked up all the bones, transported them no more than 1/4 of a mile, and then just stopped. And unlike hot syrup or water, when it gets to a flat area, that stuff spreads out. But this debris flow is so thick that it just stops and freezes in place. So normally if an animal dies, its skeleton is laid out on the bottom of the lake or river, right? Everything's flat. But we find bones in all different orientations at the Mother's Day site, which tells us, again, that debris flow just stopped. Now, why were they teenagers? We don't know. That is the one hole in the hypothesis. It could have been a group of teenagers. There's plenty of animals today that once you get to a certain age, they kick you out of the herd. And then when you get to be an adult, you get to come back, kind of like the Lion King. You get to come back and fight for your position back in the herd. So it could have been a situation like that. Or maybe it wasn't a band of teenagers. It could have been just a herd of all different ages. And what we have learned by studying large animals like in Africa, elephants, for example, is that if you have a drought, the teenagers are the first ones to go. Babies can last longer because they have all that baby fat and they have more fluid. They can just last longer. Adults can last longer because they have longer legs, and with relatively less energy, they can just walk farther and find some water or die somewhere else. But the teenagers are thin, lean, just meat and bones. They don't have much of that body fat. They don't have any reserves. They're the first ones to go in a drought. So I think I hit all the points. Did you have any more questions about? Okay. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Coming.
Okay, about the same bones. Why only one skull?
Oh, skulls are such a pain. It's really frustrating that we don't find more, but skulls in general, especially for reptiles, are very loosely put together. All other bones are kind of sutured together like this. Skulls are usually kind of loosely put together like this, and that partly allows some flexibility. But when it comes to dying and rotting, they're the first things to fall apart. But also, most of those bones are relatively flat and small. I mean, think about the body size to head ratio of an animal that looks like, getting there, that. So their skulls are small. They're loosely sutured together, so they fall apart easily. And with all the brains and stuff in there, they rot pretty fast. And since they're flat, they're hydrodynamically designed practically to be flipped and rolled away down a river. And also, again, they're small. I mean, a femur the size of me, I've worked on some, It's going to take a lot more water pressure to move it away. It's much more robust, so it's going to take a lot more force to break it. And it's just by fact of being bigger, it's easier to find. And skull bones too, they don't look like much unless they have the teeth sticking out. They don't look like much, so I think they're easily missed as well. Any other questions?
Was that Anderson site you referenced the one over in Shell?
No, we don't go as far as Shell. Our drive from Red Lodge every morning is long enough. So Mother's Day is kind of near Bridger, and then the Anderson area is kind of near Warren. I'd be more specific, but the BLM wants us to keep them secret, and also there's nothing else near us, so I literally couldn't be more specific. We're just at the foot of the Pryors. I meant to mention, too, that there's so many other amazing and discoveries that are completely revolutionary to paleontology from the Bighorn Basin. Deinonychus was a dinosaur found in 1969 that proved the link between dinosaurs and birds and completely revolutionized the science of paleontology, kicked off the golden age of dinosaur paleontology that we're still in. That was found right outside of Bridger. The first dinosaur eggs found anywhere outside of China, found right outside of Bridger. Just a couple years ago, someone finally proved, or not proved, but found really good evidence and compelling evidence for migration routes of certain species of dinosaur. That was found in the Bighorn Basin. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's so many amazing finds have been from this area. And it's full of resources. Shell, you mentioned, the Wyoming Dinosaur Center in Thermopolis is a fantastic site. There's just no end to the list of amazing paleo in this area.
One question from online. Do you know if there were significant species pulled from the Jurassic Mal?
I do, but they are very, very secretive about that site. So I'm really not even supposed to acknowledge the existence of that site. Yeah, that's another amazing site. I can say that they're working in similar rocks to ours, and they have incredible stuff. But that's about all I can say. I'm sorry? I have not worked there because they're very, very protective of it. I have been allowed on that site 3 times, and 2 of those were because I had MakeAWish kids with me, and that was it. So they're not completely shutting it off, but pretty much. The folks who are in charge of that site, the museums, the scientists at that site.
While we're on the topic of maintaining integrity of sites, would you just briefly mention, before anyone gets really excited about identifying layers and going out with their favorite tool, some of the legalities behind collecting and permitting and then possession and transportation of fossils?
Sure, absolutely. So this is one of the very few countries in the entire world where if you find stuff on private land and you have permission, you can do whatever you want with the bones. You can blow it up, you can grind it into powder, you can do anything. And I get it, private land rights, totally fine with that. But there's a lot of BLM land out here, and they do have very specific laws and some fairly recent laws that they've passed. You can collect up to 10 pounds a day, and if I remember right, 120 pounds in a year of fossil invertebrates, so usually like shells, clams, things like that, and fossil plants. But it is a felony of federal law to collect any vertebrate fossils or dinosaur bones without a permit. And so all of the fossils that we collect, they still are owned by the public, by you guys, and taken care of by the BLM. Once we are done with them, when we bring them back to the lab, we put them back together, clean them up, study them, use them for education and outreach, and then they go to their permanent home at Cincinnati. And even there, they're still property of the government and the people of the United States. But they take that very seriously when collecting fossils.
You say permit, how do you get one of those?
You have to fill out an application that's not that lengthy or complicated to the BLM. You have to show that you have good intentions and you have some kind of experience. You don't have to be a PhD or anything like that, but you have to prove also where those fossils are going to end up. So which museum's going to take them? I get a letter from Cincinnati saying, yes, they're happy to take our stuff. But it's a fairly simple process. No. We do not keep them. Again, they stay the property of the citizens of the United States in another museum.
Another way to think about that too is these are resources that are being extracted from public lands, and so they should then be publicly accessible.
Yes.
So if you have a federal permit to possess and transport and study research these permits, but then you're hoarding them in your home, then they're no longer available to be studied, to be researched, to advance the field of science. So that is why there is some selectivity, but as Jason mentioned, it's mostly a formality process of where is the designated repository, and how can researchers from across the globe access and study these things. Another question from online, and before you answer, I'll chime in here as well, but one of our members from the online audience asked about, what about women paleontologists? And I would encourage this person to go back on our Draper YouTube and go look for Dr. Ingrid Lundin, who was a lunchtime expedition speaker. She is an Eocene paleontologist and gave a presentation just a little bit ago, so definitely check for that. But Jason, if you'd mention any women paleontologists either working in this region or that you know of and contributions to the field.
Absolutely. I am happy to say that half of our field staff are female. I have 2 other full-time and year-round employees in addition to myself. Both of them are women. When I first started going to the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology meetings, which is our big meeting every year, when I first started going 20 years ago, it was mostly men. It was about 80% men. It is easily at least half female now. So we've come a long way in that regard. And if people want to reach out to me, I will be more than happy to put them in touch with Katie. Katie is our lab manager. I meant to point her out. I would be happy to put you in touch with Katie. That's Katie. Another picture I showed was of Grace. She's one of our PhD students. And Sky is working in the field right now as we speak. So we've got quite a few young ladies.
There's another question online about the Jurassic Mal. Before I ask this, I'm just going to preface this with the answer is probably pretty obvious. The question is the Jurassic Mal secretive due to keeping the site integrity or keeping the property owners protected? And I guess you can think of it this way. A lot of these objects, a lot of these specimens are very important and potentially valuable. Well, they're very valuable to the scientific community, but if you think about the endangered species trade, you think about things like CITES, there are black markets for these things. So when that information is made very publicly available, you have people with not so good intentions going out to these places without permission and doing things they shouldn't be doing. So oftentimes a lot of this stuff is kept under wraps because for as many good apples as there are, there's always a couple scenarios or individuals where you have people doing things they shouldn't be doing. So there's a reason for the secretive nature of a lot of these things. But Jason, please feel free to elaborate anything I may have missed.
No, absolutely. The answer to the specific question is yes to all of the above, is to protect the site and the integrity. Fossil poaching is a real thing and a real problem. And one of the main reasons that the BLM requires us to keep the site's exact locations a secret. When we bring folks out there, we tell them, you have to turn your GPSs off, and you can take pictures of fossils and share those, and you can take pictures of the landscape and share those, but you cannot take pictures of the fossil that also shows the landscape and then share that, because people will match that up with Google Earth or just their knowledge of the area and go out and find spots and steal fossils from you and I and everybody. Fossils that belong to all of us.
Pass this down if you would, thank you.
So you talked about finding fossils on private land and that they're allowed to keep them. Are you aware of any really important finds on private land that are they just keep them in their house and show them off?
Oh,
or how
well,
are they when they find them, the owners of this land? Are they philanthropic? Are they not?
Some are, and some give them to museums, which obviously we really appreciate. But ever since sue the T-Rex. And if you don't know that story, it's kind of long and complicated. I encourage you to look it up. Ever since that dinosaur was found on private land and then McDonald's bought it for $11 million, anyone who finds a nice dinosaur specimen on their land gets big dollar signs in their eyes. And honestly, I can't blame them. You see that landscape. This is a hard way to make a living if you're a rancher. This is hard. If you have $11 million you can sit on and you can get from an auction, I can't blame them for that. But there are famous people who seem to like to buy those things at the auctions. I hear Nicolas Cage and Leonardo DiCaprio are two infamous guys with big skeletons in their houses. So there are some folks who donate those to the museums, but more and more they get sent to Christie's to be auctioned in New York and in Europe. While we're waiting on other questions, I forgot to mention more about my organization. So we bring people from all over the world to help us find and dig up dinosaurs here in the basins. And usually it's for a week. Some people just come for a day, especially families that are local and with younger kids. So if anybody's interested in doing that, please feel free to reach out to me. I think my email address, I'm going to be annoying. Oh, there we go. Yep, that's my email address. I do have some cards. I did not expect this many people, so I don't have that many cards. Also, I really meant to bring specimens today to show off that we found this year, and I just forgot. I'm sorry about that. But if you guys come to the fun run in Red Lodge on Labor Day weekend, I'll be there with a booth, and we'll have some of those specimens from this year. We've got a great claw and some toes from the Mother's Day site and a whole bunch of other stuff.
I think you answered the last question here, and that is from a University of Wyoming geology student wondering what the best way is to get involved with the local digs. Field digs.
Well, come up to Red Lodge. If she's a student, the first 2 weeks of our field season are mostly for college students. They can get a 2-week, 3-credit college course through MSUB. Credits transfer anywhere. They learn not just about the paleo, but how to run an expedition. But there's lots of digs around. Again, there's plenty around the Bighorn Basin if she can't make ours. I guess that's the best way. Thank you guys very much.